Welcome you all to this video lecture. Here in this video lecture, we are going to discuss regarding to the previous video lectures continuation only. So exceptions. So in that previous video, we discussed regarding how the interrupt is get handled and the priority arbitrations are being executed. So simple term, interrupt a normal request from an external device. So here in this video lecture, this exception says is an unusual condition detected during where means the processor operation. So the in the previous video we have seen what will happen when one or more IO devices requires an attention to the top processor. So we saw as an IRQ interrupt request. So that in that the IRQ interrupt enable and pending interrupt and priority arbitrations has been carried forward over there. So now we have a clear picture, which means that we have understood that how that an interrupt is generally associated with the request for service from an external devices. So now here let us have considered a different situation and scenario. Think that what happens if something goes wrong while the processor is executing an instruction. So let us for an example here I can say suppose the processor need to detect spot an error in a data being used. So or an abnormal condition occurs during instruction execution means. So here this is not a simply a normal IO request. So need to get an debugging term and we need to find an error that so that the processor has to be respond what to that of conditions immediately. Such situation is called as an exception. So exception is nothing that how can I say means it is a event based thing that will causes the normal sequences of program execution to be interrupted because of an unusual or an abnormal conditions. So simply we can say is if for an example a normal program is there. So during the normal program executions, abnormal condition has been created. So from that the exception is get been formed. So that exception has some routines. So after that it will go for the recovery state and handling. So which means that if the processor detect an exception, it will temporarily stop the normal flow of programs. So that only after that it will transfer the control to that of appropriate exception service routine. So after that conditions is handled, the processor may either recover it or the continuous executions or terminate the affected operations depending upon the type of exceptions. So here this exception is need why we need means. So the basic purpose of exception is to need to handle an abnormal condition during where the program executions. So the next is we need to have a clear picture on what term means an interrupt versus an executions. So interrupt I versus exceptions. So here at this point we should need to clearly have some distinguished an interrupt how an interrupt is get differ from an exception. So interrupt is nothing that it will get associated with an external event. So some another device is connected to a laptop or a desktop. So such as an IO devices requesting what a processor service, whereas this exception is nothing that it is an unusual condition detected during the processor operations. So in or else instruction execution. So in the term of IE and the exception will be get generated, whereas this interrupt is formed over where means it occurs in the processor conditions. So simply we can say interrupt is usually comes from an outside the processor, while the exception is associated with the condition detected during the processor operation. So the next is the exception service things. Here the program is get executed. Exception is get been detected means it will save the required state. So after that it will forms the service routine and handle that things. After it will have to form over to the return to that recovery state. The important point is that here is the processor does not simply ignore the abnormal conditions. It changes the normal program flow so that the condition can be get handled. if for an example, real time example, we can say means if you are process your work for a long time means we need some recovery time, which means that some sleep time we need to have. So that lapping time is called as an, here the exception is getting formed over there. So then now we need to have some recovery of when those error is, suppose an instruction is using a data and the processor deducts the error associated with that operation means it cannot instantly, it cannot blindly continuing the process. The processor transfer the control to exception handler, so that handler will identify as the problem and takes us the appropriate actions. So now we need to have that things is, which means that here the problem takes of some appropriate action means, so debugging textures, breakpoint, trace modes so these things is we need to get involved over there to get recovery those things is. So the debugging and trace and the breakpoints is means, here let's for an example, here the exceptions are not used for only for handling the error, they can also be used as for as a debugging terms as also. If for an example, a programmer is typing to find an error in a program means it is useful to stop an execution at particular point of times, and we need to examine that, which means that we need to test and we need to examine that processor state. So the processor here, that mechanism is called as a debugging terms is trace and breakpoints is for this purpose of get debugging terms is. So next is that the trace is nothing, that traces is also a debugging mechanism also. Here that allows us the program program execution to be monitored, so that after that monitored thing the instructions can be executed. So it now it also get helps us the programmer to observe how the program progresses instructions by instruction or through the selected execution points. Using simply we say that using this trace, the program can observe what means the sequence of the executions and what it will identify where the program is behaving differently from what was expected. So the next is the breakpoint. In this breakpoint, now I can say with an example means, if suppose a program suspects an error occurs and around a particular instruction, the common breakpoint can be placed at that location. So when the processor reaches that point, the execution gets stops and the program can examine that particular special purpose general purpose register, a special register, memory, and the process and the other process informations. So the thing we need to have a clear picture over this trace mode, which means that trace and the breakpoint is, trace will helps in monitoring the program execution, whereas breakpoint stops the execution at the selected point. Whereas this trace is used for debugging, breakpoint is also used for the debugging process also. In trace we can able to get up can observe this execution step by step. Here the program breakpoint, in that programmer selects the stopping location and performs the operations. So the next is that real time processing terms. So this real time, here the exception handling is also important in system where the processor wants to need to respond to that event within a specific time. So let's for an example, let for an real time system, an unexpected condition or an error can get cannot be get simplified by means it will be get ignored. The processor must detect the condition and executes what the appropriate handling mechanism within that required time. So this therefore this exception handling is a part of making what the processor system as a reliable term, unpredictable term. So the next thing is we need to have this complete exception flow means, let us now get combined. Now we have say need to get combined the complete processor, and we are going to say this, what the processor is executing what a normal program. So during the execution an abnormal condition is detected. So make this scenario as a flow. So the processor is executing a normal program thing. So during that execution, what has been arrived? An abnormal condition is get arrived. So here the processor need to recognize that exception, saves us the what the required execution state, and transfer the control to that what appropriate execution service routine. So after that the handler examines the condition. To that handling that condition, it again it will do the process, it will performance the required action. If recovery is possible, then the processor can return to the top appropriate point in the program. If the condition cannot be recovered from the system, may get terminate the or affected the operation, or taken another appropriate terms. Simply we can say the program starts. So program gets started, PGM gets started, instruction executes, IE. So the instruction points is 100 means, so 100 instruction came. So after that a breakpoint is get arrived. So debugger, so examine the what examines that register, specific register or a memory. So this is the things is have been get uh, compiled over in this video. So now we have some complete knowledge over that interrupt and the execution part. So now we need to have some idea or a question need to arise when the processor has to communicate with that memory and IO device. How does the information actually travel between that these component means? So already we in that normal class itself we have discussed the transferring or communication get done over using what the system bus. So those things is going to have in that upcoming video lecture we are going to see. Thank you.